The Soviet Union is a funny thing. While some idealize it and long for the past, others speaks of the millions of innocents sent to camps and celebrate the collapse of the once vast state. But where is the truth? And more importantly, what would have happened if the USSR hadn't collapsed? Dozens of dissertations and academic papers have been written on this topic, but the essence can actually be summarized in a few minutes of video. Right now, we'll show you this after your comment on whether you would have liked to live in the USSR or not. As usual, the process of a state collapsing involved a million little things. Let's start with the main one – the people. According to the All-Union referendum of March 17, 1991, 77% of USSR residents voted in favor of preserving the Union. The referendum was quite powerful. Nearly 150 million people participated in it. It created a funny paradox, because in fact the result of a national vote is more important than any president's, leaders' or officials' decree. The leaders of Russia, Ukraine and other countries had to work hard to legally recognize the referendum results as either illegal or outdated. Many fans of the USSR still refer to this vote to this day. However, there are several major caveats that must be taken into account. First, the referendum wasn't about preserving the Union in its original form. To be precise, it mentioned the preservation of the USSR as a renewed federation of equal sovereign republics. This wording is highly vague and ambiguous. As a result, by voting yes, people were simultaneously voting for both the preservation of the USSR and for the independence of their particular country, as that's what was being discussed. The referendum implied the creation of a new union, the Union of Sovereign States, which was supposed to be the name of the updated entity. As you can see, the word Soviet was removed from the name. These concepts also existed, but individual parts of the country were declaring their independence live on air, and the country's leadership, led by Gorbachev, was trying to come up with anything to reform the federation and keep it within the same borders, even if it meant dissolving the Communist Party. The attempt failed, and the referendum itself raises suspicions, as besides the unclear wording, Latvia, Estonia and other countries refused to hold it. The story of how votes were collected from those places is rather murky, and it doesn't matter anyone. The referendum and everything that happened after 1990 was a stage of agony. To understand what the world would have been like if the USSR had survived, we need to look more closely at the reasons for its collapse, and unfortunately there are many. A favorite argument of the Union's opponents is toilet paper. Indeed, according to most sources, it only began to be used widely by the early 1970s. On November 3, 1969, the Siatsky Paper Mills Department that produced regular toilet paper in industrial quantities was launched. Of course, it existed before then, but not in the same quantities and not in the same hygienic form as in Western countries. Some claim that separate factories existed even before World War II, but there is where the very detail that led to the Union's collapse lies. There were few reliable, independent and objective sources that could be trusted. The truth had to be approved from above. Even disasters on the scale of Chernobyl were hidden until the last minute. And there were more, such as the sinking of the Admiral Nahimov, a gas explosion and numerous aviation incidents. One of the most tragic events was the largest disaster in Armenian history when in 1988 an Il-76M crashed near Leninakan, killing 77 people. All these events were hidden, which could not be create a stifling atmosphere in society, as well as mistrust of Soviet technology in general. To this day, USSR supporters rely on foreign achievements in science and technology to convey their thoughts. By the early 1980s, the term Soviet had come to mean something of poor quality. The reason for this was the government's focus on mass production. Manufacturers weren't concerned with the quality of goods. The party demanded quantity. Since 1953, enterprise performance plants in the USSR didn't focus on quality, only volume, and as a result, being a car mechanic in the Union was considered almost magical. Everything depended on them, as cars broke down at every step. The main mistake made by anyone who enters a debate about the preservation of the Union is communism. The USSR is often considered a communist state, but in reality it wasn't. The Union was a semi-feudal empire with a clear ruling class, and it wasn't the working people, but the nomenklatura, elite bureaucratic class. Officials, the military and bureaucrats, these were the people who ruled the country and lived in completely different conditions. Take a look at the sign of the Soviet store Berezka. Did you know that ordinary workers weren't allowed to enter, and inside you could freely buy Mars bars, Ferrero chocolates, and any products of the cursed capitalists? In fact, it was these products that the people spread in myths about the most wholesome Soviet foods consumed. Ironic, isn't it? Of course, at this point, many will start presenting facts and arguments against this, but there is one comparison that captures the situation best. After World War II, Germany was divided into several parts. But the Germans wanted to be a united country, and at the first opportunity, they tore down the wall that divided them. Meanwhile, almost all of Eastern Europe was under Soviet influence. But when Gorbachev issued a decree to stop intervening in the affairs of other countries, magic happened. In 1989, the Communists were overthrown in Czechoslovakia. In 1990, Poland and almost all other Eastern Bloc countries switched to democratic paths. People simply didn't like the existing system, which was upheld by the military and total censorship. When the USSR collapsed, there were no strong movements for reunification like in Germany. The overwhelming majority of the former Soviet republics were happy to be independent and are still happy about it today. This means that when thinking about what the world would have been like if the USSR had survived, we need to start from several key points. The first and most obvious is 1991, after the referendum. The Union's unity is preserved by force. Democrats and independent supporters are eliminated by the KGB, and the Soviet Union returns. What would have changed in this scenario? Nothing. Just imagine the current situation, but with completely inability to travel abroad, access foreign products, or get any truthful information from the media. The power of the classic USSR rested in force, and we would already be in prison if that union had survived in 1991. Things get a bit more interesting if we go back about 5 years to the beginning of Gorbachev's reign. In general, he proposed the only possible reform for the situation – perestroika. On paper, it looked great – freedom of speech, a shift to market economy, and fair elections. But it was implemented in the most disastrous way. Instead of openness, people got the Chernobyl cover-up. Instead of a market economy, they got food ration cards. Instead of fair elections, there were numerous riots and the rise of strange politicians from nowhere. And for the love of God, don't call us fans of the HBO series. There is an official document stating that everything was fine at the nuclear plant and no evacuation of Pripyat was necessary. It wasn't until the kind-hearted Scandinavians detected the radioactive cloud that anyone rushed to save people. The nomenclatura, the Soviet ruling elite, didn't want to lose their privileged status and did everything to maintain it. But if the Union had truly reformed as things looked on paper, the situation would have been amusing, because the closest analogy to the final state Gorbachev had in mind is the USA. There, each state has its own laws, but only fringe elements seriously call for independence. In Arizona, you can't feed pigs garbage, while in Illinois, they recently legalized marijuana. That's roughly the structure that was planned for the Union of Sovereign States. Each state would do what it wanted, formally reporting to a central authority. The problem was that the Soviet bureaucrats didn't want to lose the people who fed them, and society was too tired of the low standard of living and ready to support anyone just to see some change. But if Gorbachev and his team had managed an effective perestroika, the world would have been quite interesting. Many blame the US for hybrid warfare and imposing its values, but what stopped the USSR from doing the same? The only thing lacking was real competition with Western cars, movies, jeans, and many other things. And crucially, the same kind of powerful advertising for those products. If the possibility of doing business without theft had appeared, then the still mighty industrial base of the USSR could have certainly produced something worthwhile. We don't have to look far for an example. China. For a long time they copied Western designs, but eventually they started producing worthy alternatives, which many people even in the US now use. In China, they conducted their reforms differently, cracking down on officials, not the people. Thus, there are two versions of a hypothetically surviving USSR. In the first, classic version, we'd still be dreaming of foreign kitchen sets while watching officials' children eating Kinder Surprises from stores for the privileged. In the second version, the Union of Independent States would have embarked on a difficult but entirely feasible path of its own, with its own iPhones and Mercedes-Benzes. Unfortunately, things turned out the way they did, and we shouldn't only blame the government for that. Indeed, and the emergence of a just and powerful state is impossible as long as people are content with a low standard of living. By the way, according to the Constitution, the people are the source of power, but not everyone understands this. Until next time, friends.